Excited tonight. We have a good friend of Training Ground, Dr. Paul Penley. He teaches every week during the summer to our Training Ground guys and has his Ph.D. in Biblical Studies. So really excited, grateful that you're here tonight, Paul, and really looking forward to this time. Would love to start off just hearing about your story, kind of the Ph.D. and all the time, the hundreds of hours you spent studying the Bible and how you became passionate with it.
It definitely has a story that starts in my childhood. You don't walk out of the house one day and say, let's spend 10 years and 3 degrees in the basement of a library. But when I was about 13, I got just pretty psyched about studying the Bible for the reason of had an experience with Christ where he became real. He became a friend. And at that moment, I was like, wow, I want more of this. How do I live my life His way? And what I was given was the Bible. So this is how to live His way. Okay, let's say, great, let's learn more. But how do you do that? So I started, going to the Christian bookstore, looking at every book they had, with no understanding of what was good, what was helpful, what was out of date, what was relevant. And I kind of took that track. But that's what led me ultimately to want to figure out, okay, if God's way is the way to live, and the Bible is what's going to help me understand His way, well, that led me to one Bible college degree, it pushed me on to seminary, it pushed me on to get the Ph.D.
So Paul, assume someone is starting at ground zero with understanding the Bible. Maybe you're sitting across, a table from a 20-something, maybe that's even watching this video series, or maybe even a new believer. What kind of recommendations or advice would you give them, even to start with kind of understanding the Bible well?
I think it's a good question to ask because pastors, Christian leaders, authors, most folks out there are saying, here's a Bible, read that Bible, right, but no one's telling us how do we understand it first and then apply it to our lives. Right. And so we've got to figure this out of basic questions of, where should I start and how do I go about it? So a couple tips on reading Scripture. One, I'd say read it book by book. Most likely start out somewhere in the New Testament and read the whole book from start to finish before you begin looking at individual verses, paragraphs, or chapters. Right. Because you need to understand how the parts fit into the whole. Right. It's the same reason when it comes to verse memorization. We're all encouraged, Philippians 4:13 or John 3:16, different verses, memorize them so that you can have them on the ready to remember what God has said to us. Well, when you're doing that, I'd say be real careful that you don't forget the meaning of that verse in its context. So an easy practice to have is to make sure you always have one sentence memorized about the context of any verse that you memorize. Again, it's going to really help you with typically misunderstood verses like Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, and we turn around and it's like, man, I have the power to do anything I set my mind to. Right. Well, in the context, that verse isn't saying if you want to fly, jump off a building, you can. Jesus is there. Paul's saying, there were times when I had nothing, and there was times when I had everything I needed. In all those situations, I found the secret to being content. And so when it comes to Philippians 4:13, he's saying, in any circumstance that you find yourself, right, Christ gives you the power to be content, right, not to do anything you want. So if you can memorize something about the context that will help us not misuse scriptures, right, which, probably dangerous to put words into God's mouth. I got in trouble when I did that with my mom growing up. How much of a bigger deal is it putting them in God's mouth, misrepresenting Him?
Right. Both of us grew up in the South, kind of grew up in Southern spirituality. We're very familiar with, daily devotionals and quiet times in the Word. Knowing what you know now, with your Ph.D., what kind of processes could you invite us into to share with us about how to engage the Scripture on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think when you're younger in the faith, when your knowledge of what's going on in the whole of the Bible is still fairly thin, I think using devotional guides from other teachers is appropriate and helpful. Bible reading plans, if you do read the Bible in a year type Bible reading plan, I think that's a great thing to grow your basic Bible knowledge, and particularly if you can do that with others who are doing it at the same time. Right. Because we often have this mistaken notion that it's supposed to be me, God, and my Bible, and that's the Christian life. Right. But that's more Western individualism speaking than the picture we even have of life with God in the Bible, which is one of community always. Right. And so read with other folks who are going through the same types of books or the same types of devotional help materials so that you can have conversations about what you're reading. Because none of us were meant to just, me and God, a quiet time in my private space, learning without other instruction. And so we've kind of forgotten, really since the Protestant Reformation, the last 500 years, there's been this bigger push to just individually grow yourself. Whereas the Bible talks about, no, we always function as communities, and those communities always have leaders who understand the biblical truth, better than we do. Right. So relying on them, whether it's an author or a living mentor who's talking through what we're reading, right. Both of those are good plans.
So if I came at you with a question like, what does it mean to enter the presence of God? What would your response be?
Well, from my perspective, it's always a bit of a strange question, since I would say, well, God is everywhere.
Right.
And if you're missing him, it's not because you need to go find him somewhere else, right. But it's because you're not looking. Sure. You're not paying attention. And so I don't encourage folks to go on a spiritual retreat as a way to think of experiencing God's presence. No, you need to get away. You need to get it quiet. You need to take a hike to the top of a mountain and eat angel food cake. Right. What I'd say is begin to discover him in every moment of every day. Right. And so you need to be able to experience the presence of God while you're working, as much as while you are alone. All those things should be good and excellent opportunities to experience his presence. But part of that, could go back to a very simple verse, the very first verse I ever memorized in 1 Thessalonians 5. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in everything. Right. And that is, don't have times where you're open to hearing and speaking to God and then the rest of your life. Right. All of life, maintain an open channel with God. Right. Doesn't mean you need to be speaking out loud your prayers or you're never having a focused thought on the work in front of you. But keeping that open channel is unbelievably important for not missing him because he is there.
So as we walk through this idea of biblical interpretation, Paul, could you walk us through, outline maybe what good interpretation looks like and the downfall of bad interpretation?
Well, that's why I started my journey, is because the benefits were so big. One of the verses I learned early on was Ecclesiastes 7:29, which says, God has made humanity to live the correct way, but each of us has chosen a downward path. And so the possibility of navigating life with Scripture can get me to not just the right way to live, but the best way to live because God designed it. Right. So to me, that is what drives you. That's what inspires you. That's what makes you do the hard work of make sure you're getting it right and not putting words in God's mouth. Because you have the opportunity to live life the way it was meant to be. Most of us think you read the Bible to find a bunch of do's and a bunch of don'ts. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of don'ts with things you actually want to do. That's the misperception, is that God imposes a way that you should or have to live. No, the Bible exposes the way to live. And so when you understand Scripture correctly, you can see what that looked like long ago and find trajectories from Scripture to follow today in terms of living God's way and experiencing all that life has for us. So that is the number one reason why I work so hard, to get it right. It isn't about winning arguments late night at the coffee shop. This is what that Bible verse really means.
You're so smart.
Right, and we can all, fall trap, to that temptation to just win the next argument, as opposed to, again, the Bible's purpose is to transform us.
Sure.
And if all it does is inform us, then we're not all the way there.
Right.
And so you've got to get to life application. Now, if you don't interpret Scripture correctly, what are the dangers? There's a few. I mean, all the time we're challenged to believe God's promises. Well, what if you're sitting there trying to make a decision in life, and it's like, well, I'm just going to, believe that God's going to, figure it out or work it out. Or if you have a misunderstanding of a promise from God, but your approach is, now I'm going to hold on to that,
Right.
What's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed with a God who doesn't even exist. Because you're believing in a God that is a misunderstanding of who, in fact, is revealed in Scripture. So many folks have a bad experience with God, and they're like, I can't trust Him, or He's not right, or He's not loving, or He's not just. But they have an image of the wrong God. So getting it right will allow you to truly experience who He is, the benefits, the direction, everything that comes from that.